Hello friends, I'm Ihor Havrishchak. Today is Monday, May 19th. Let's review the most important news that affects us Ukrainians and our Ukraine. So let's get started. Volodymyr Zelenskyy has clearly stated that there will be no compromises on Ukrainian territories. Ukraine will not abandon its course to join the North Atlantic Alliance and will continue to insist on security guarantees. Putin has once again embarrassed himself with his Yars intercontinental missile system, failing once again to launch the promised missile. White House sources say Trump may lose patience in today's talk with Putin. Before we dive into the May 19th analysis, please like, comment where you're watching from, and share your thoughts.
Поставити лайк цьому відео, прокоментувати, звідки ви дивитесь, ваші традиційні зауваження, побажання, запитання.
Your feedback helps promote Ukrainian language content and support the pro-Ukrainian stance. Subscribe to Channel 24 and my personal channel, links below. Now to the main point. Ukraine's defense forces continue to achieve impressive, even incredible results.
Почнемо з того, що наші сили оборони України продовжують робити фантастичні речі, а подекуди навіть і неймовірні.
The SBU destroyed a Russian radar and warehouses on the Boyko Towers in the Black Sea using drones. Today they released impressive footage of the operation.
Це, ви знаєте, вишки Бойка, і сьогодні вони продемонстрували ці кадри прекрасні.
Officers of the SBU's 13th Directorate carried out a joint sea and air drone operation, as reported on their Telegram channel. First, one of the towers was struck by an airborne drone, and later by a naval drone. As a result of this attack, the Neva radar station, which the enemy used to monitor the air and surface situation, as well as the warehouse and residential unit on the tower, were destroyed. During one special operation, SBU specialists used two types of drones, which showed high efficiency of joint work. The SBU emphasized that they had once again reminded the enemy that no Russian junk belongs in the Black Sea. I would also like to remind you that this is really very important. Where Boyko's towers are located, the one who controls and installs his radar stations has a much better view and the ability to probe a large area in the Black Sea. And this is very important. Our security service of Ukraine forces are really working. In addition, the Krymsky Veta Telegram channel, which is always the first to provide reliable information about events on the temporarily occupied peninsula, reports that unknown drones also attacked a military airfield in Jankoy. Explosions were heard, and the work of Russian air defense was heard. I think we will learn more about the results of the attacks later. In addition, on the left bank of the Dnipro River, in the village of Novakakovka, our aviation destroyed Russian positions. The video clearly shows that the enemy had a house there where they kept officers, personnel and boats that they launched into the Dnipro and tried to force the river towards our positions on the right bank. Our aviation used a French-made AAC M-Hammer 250 bomb. This building was completely destroyed, killing a large number of occupants. In addition, Talakivka is located 20 kilometers from Mariupol. The night before, it became known that unknown drones had also attacked Russian positions there. As a result, several Russian officers were killed, several soldiers were wounded, and equipment was damaged. I would like to remind you that the enemy is actively using Mariupol and the Mariupol region to move military equipment to the front line. So they will not be able to transfer some of it. According to sources, the fragments of the Russian air defense system, as always, worked skillfully, but in the end, they damaged their own infrastructure and hit the house where the occupiers were staying. In addition, in the Kursk sector, as reported by the Russians themselves and published in the relevant footage, our defense forces continued to advance on the village of Tyotkino. The entry of Bradley combat vehicles was spotted there. The Russians show failed FPV drone attacks on Bradleys, but these armored vehicles hold up. They don't show the ones that broke through. We'll keep monitoring. Meanwhile, yesterday, Russia threatened to launch a Yars missile tonight.
А ту техніку, яка прорвалася, вони, звісно ж, не показують. Також будемо за цим стежити. Ну і, власне, про те, як вчора грозилися в Росії запустити сьогодні вночі міжконтинентальну ракету Yars.
Russia failed to launch the RS-24 Yars missile on the night of May 19th, with no signs of a launch, Defense Express reports. All evidence suggests it simply didn't happen.
Здійснити навчально-бойовий запуск міжконтинентальної балістичної ракети РС-24, яка називається Yars. Втім, запуск так і не відбувся. У Російській Федерації не змогли його запустити. Все вказує на те, що пуску просто не було.
The reason for the cancelled launch is unknown. Experts suggest technical issues or the Kremlin's fear of showing weakness before today's Putin-Trump talk. In 2023, Russia failed 2 Yars launches. One exploded, the other veered off course. Perhaps this time it also backfired.
Росія в 2 рази поспіль намагалася запустити РС-24 Yars і 2 рази провалила з соромом. Ракети взагалі одна вибухнула, а інша відхилилась від курсу. Тому цілком ймовірно, що і цієї ночі їхня ця болванка десь впала самим росіянам на голову.
The most important thing for today is that Russian dictator Putin will have a phone conversation with US President Donald Trump on Monday at 5 p.m. Moscow time. This was announced by Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who also called the conversation very important. A possible face-to-face meeting between Putin and Trump depends on their agreements, Peskov emphasized, adding that it should be well prepared. According to Bloomberg, Putin feels confident ahead of his call with Trump, believing Russian forces can fully occupy Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia by late 2025. With this mindset, he's unlikely to offer major concessions.
Власне, про це пише Bloomberg з посиланням на джерела, знайомих з думкою кремлівського очільника. З такими настроями Путін малоймовірно запропонує суттєві поступки Трампу під час їхньої розмови, пише Bloomberg.
But what is most interesting is that European officials believe that Russia, which has suffered huge losses in more than 3 years of war, does not have the capacity to achieve Putin's goals. Even more importantly, this skepticism is shared by many of the Russian military personnel fighting in Ukraine. A person close to the Ministry of Defense of the Russian terrorist organization told the publication about this. In particular, according to him, Ukrainian drones have made Russia's large-scale offensive operations expensive and ineffective. The paper notes Putin risks pushing Trump to act on threats. U.S. officials told allies Trump may back a bill for 500% tariffs on buyers of Russian energy. Drafted by Senator Lindsey Graham, the bill has strong Senate support if Putin makes no concessions. Finnish President Olaf Scholz, who met with Graham and Trump in March, told a conference in Tallinn that he was cautiously optimistic that Graham would present his bill next week. Bloomberg also notes that the problem is that Putin has too much faith in his own strength. Over the past year, Russian troops have been able to advance only 1% along the entire front line, suffering huge losses. Putin may indeed overdo it, imposing his position on Trump, that he is very powerful, strong, and will attack. Stubb is cautiously optimistic about possible sanctions. Even if Trump wants to end the war quickly, he has no leverage over Ukraine, which produces 40% of heavy weapons and nearly all drones and electronic warfare. With strong European support, Trump's pressure is unlikely to succeed.
Українська військово-промисловий комплекс виготовляє самостійно, є підтримка від європейців, тому як би не хотів нахилити нас Трамп, в нього цього не вийде.
Moreover, the Sunday Times writes about the positions of Ukraine and Zelenskyy. They are clear, simple, and unwavering. What exactly does this publication write?
Що пише це видання?
Zelensky refuses to give up Ukraine's right to choose its future, including NATO membership, and does not recognize the loss of occupied territories like Crimea and others.
Країною-агресором Російської Федерації українських територій. Це стосується як окупованого Криму, так і інших захоплених ворогом територій України.
This is stated in an article by the Sunday Times, citing close associates of the Ukrainian president. According to the newspaper, Zelensky is not going to give up Ukraine's right to join the North Atlantic Alliance. The journalists also note that the head of state is seeking security guarantees, the commitment of international partners to support Ukraine's sovereignty in the long term. In the absence of such agreements, Ukrainian officials say that Kyiv will have to continue the fight regardless of foreign support, the article says. That is, despite what Trump says and how confident Putin is in his success, Ukraine's position remains unchanged, clear and correct. No concessions, neither in terms of territories nor in the highest level of integration, both into the European Union and NATO. And of course to demand security guarantees from our allies, because our partners are well aware of this. This was also emphasized by the European Union Commissioner. If the fighting in Ukraine stops, Europe will be under attack. We need to remember and realize this, not quarrel with each other. Instead of unity, our coalition partners are having disagreements. Let's talk about this now. Before speaking with Putin, Trump spoke with the leaders of the coalition of the willing. French President Emmanuel Macron said that he, along with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and other leaders, had a phone conversation with U.S. President Donald Trump about his planned conversation with dictator Putin today. He wrote about this last night on his X network. What exactly? Yesterday, May 18th, I spoke with U.S. President Donald Trump, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni after our talks in Kyiv and Tirana. Macron said. According to him, during his conversation with Trump, Putin should demonstrate his desire for peace by agreeing to a 30-day ceasefire. Tomorrow, which is today, because the recording was made yesterday, President Putin should confirm this by accepting the 30-day unconditional ceasefire proposed by President Trump and supported by Ukraine and Europe. The US and Trump backed a 30-day unconditional ceasefire, but Putin rejected it. Likely Putin will boast of strength and ignore the ceasefire, giving Trump grounds to consider new sanctions.
Путін буде розповідати, що він сильний і дуже непереможний буде наступати, а як же 30 днів? І саме це мало би спонукати Трампа вести якісь санкції.
But share your thoughts in the comments. It seems to me that Trump will again say that the conversation was productive. I know Putin well, like we are getting closer to peace. Then the opening of water in a mortar will begin. They will say that Ukraine and Russia are getting closer to an agreement. And again, they will equate Ukrainian defenders' heroes with terrorist occupiers who are dying on both sides. The forecast is that nothing will be resolved in fact. Perhaps, as the White House says, Trump will really lose his patience and apply pressure by imposing sanctions. Then he will be able to say, see, I'm putting pressure on Putin, although Russia claims that it is ready for these sanctions and that they will not cause significant damage. We'll see, because the shadow fleet is Trump's main source of income. If the sanctions really do affect the shadow fleet, the Kremlin will see its finances shrink significantly. These losses will hit ordinary Russians more than Russia's military-industrial complex. On May 18th, despite disputes among Meloni and allies in the EU, they seem to have established some contacts ahead of the talks. German Chancellor Merkel likely resolved the diplomatic dispute between Rome and Paris after Italian PM Meloni was excluded from recent EU-US talks on Russia's war in Ukraine. The Financial Times writes this: to set the chronology, the newspaper is referring not to yesterday's conversation, but to the one of the 16th, when Volodymyr Zelenskyy arrived in Albania. As you may recall, Erdogan also arrived there after the joint meeting, and European leaders gathered for a summit. The coalition of the willing also spoke with Trump, but Meloni did not participate in the conversation. She told reporters that she was not invited to this phone call on the 16th, allegedly because Italy refused to send its military contingent to Ukraine, while the coalition of the willing was ready to do so. Macron said that this was not true. It was not the European contingent in Ukraine that was being discussed, but a 30-day ceasefire at least. Merz also said this, noting that Europe is far from discussing its contingent in Ukraine. The main focus is on a ceasefire. They seem to have settled disputes, though ironically just when Europe needs unity most, they argue over who is more right and determined. This shouldn't happen. EC President von der Leyen said this week is crucial for ending Russia's war against Ukraine, during talks with Italy's PM Meloni and VP Vance in Rome, where Russian aggression was a key topic.
У повідомленні йдеться, що під час переговорів глава Єврокомісії також порушила тему російської війни проти України.
What unites us, she said, is the desire for a just and lasting peace. I know how involved you are in ending this war, and I thank you for that, von der Leyen said, addressing Vance and obviously referring to the administration of U.S. President Donald Trump. Now it is definitely important to move the situation forward, and I believe that the next week, this week, as she said on Sunday, will be crucial. The point is that during a telephone conversation between Trump and Putin, it will be finally decided whether Putin will agree to a ceasefire or not. Of course, he will not agree. He is Putin, and there are no compromises with a dictator. By the way, you mentioned J.D. Vance, right? Yesterday I told you that Volodymyr Zelenskyy, Andriy Yermak and our Foreign Minister Sibiga met with Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance. The meeting was relaxed and friendly, with no tension or quarrels. It felt like everything was already agreed upon, especially noticeable without Trump, who pressures and claims Ukraine has no trump cards.
Що означає, коли немає, бачите, поруч Трампа, коли немає того, хто там тисне і розказує, що в Україні Зеленського немає козирів.
They were really sitting peacefully with a slight smile on their faces and talking, but the conversation lasted only 40 minutes. Why so little time? It's very simple. The United States, Vance and Rubio in particular, know Ukraine's position very well, and Ukraine knows exactly what it wants, and we have already talked about it. There is nothing to discuss here. Everything is clear and understandable. Instead, the United States and Russia usually talk for a very long time, because Putin has many unacceptable demands, and we need to look for where he can give in. They can't give in but still talk. The 40-minute conversation was clear. Ukraine is a victim, demands security guarantees, NATO membership, and full Russian withdrawal. This was also Vance's first meeting with Zelenskyy after the recent scandal. After the meeting, Vance said of Zelenskyy, "Our countries share the goal of ending the unnecessary bloodshed in Ukraine." He also discussed ceasefire talks and lasting peace. Notably, he now refers to our countries, showing united positions.
Дуже важливо, що він сказав наші країни. Розумієте, якщо він раніше казав, от там Україна, я там знаю, що там відбувається з телефону, він поєднав.
This is really important, he writes. Our countries, meaning united. This is of great importance. In the United States, not only sources, but also White House officials promised to increase sanctions. The United States, along with Europe, will not hesitate to increase pressure on the Russian Federation if Kremlin ruler Putin does not conduct peace talks in good faith. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told CBS News that Trump clearly emphasized the need to see what happens when both sides negotiate. Bessent admitted sanctions were ineffective under Biden, kept low to avoid raising domestic oil prices.
Тримала їх на низькому рівні, бо боялися, що це підштовхне внутрішні ціни на нафту.
Today we will see how the phone call goes and what the results will be announced in the Kremlin and the White House. Speaking of Joe Biden, he was diagnosed with an aggressive form of prostate cancer at the 4th stage with bone metastases. The former U.S. president's press service said that Biden and his family are currently consulting with doctors about further treatment. The spread of cancer in the bones means that at this stage the disease is incurable. However, according to doctors, thanks to modern medicine, many patients with this diagnosis live for another 3 to 5 years or even more. Let me remind you that Joe Biden is now 82 years old. By the way, it was unexpected that the current U.S. President Donald Trump reacted to the news of Biden's diagnosis by wishing him a speedy recovery. He wrote about it on his social media, and we quote, "Sending our warmest and best wishes to Jill, the First Lady, and their family." We also wish Joe a speedy and successful recovery, Donald Trump wrote in his post. Importantly, Romania held presidential elections. The pro-European and pro-Ukrainian mayor of Bucharest, Nico Chardin, won the election. According to the Electoral Commission, he received more than 53.5% of the vote, while his opponent, the far-right pro-Russian candidate Giorgio Simeon, received 46.4%. According to the Romanian Service of Radio Liberty, the voter turnout was historic, almost 65%, 64%. This indicates that about 12 million people cast their votes, given that 18 million Romanians are registered in the permanent voter rolls. This is a very high figure. This is your victory. This is the victory of thousands and thousands of people who campaigned these days and believed that Romania could change in the right direction, Nico Chardin told his supporters. He went out on the balcony where tens of thousands of people greeted him. The new president respected supporters of pro-Russian candidate Simeon and others from the first round. Simeon initially claimed victory hours after the election, but later conceded and congratulated pro-Ukrainian Nico Chardin, Romania's new president. Zelenskyy congratulated Nico Chardin on X, calling his victory historic. He emphasized the importance of a reliable Romanian partner and expressed confidence in strengthening both countries and Europe together. By the way, it is interesting to mention Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who just yesterday said that he is categorically against Ukraine's accession to the European Union. He claims that this could destroy Hungary's economy. Furthermore, in an unprecedented move, Orban has asked NATO to protect Hungary from Ukraine. You can imagine how populist and absurd Orban's personality is. It is interesting that even the regions of Romania, with a Hungarian population, actively voted for the pro-Ukrainian politician, and now President of Romania, Nicu Chardin. This is an alarming signal for Orban, who is up for election in 2026. The pro-Russian candidate in Romania has constantly criticized Hungarians, which creates additional problems for Orban. In fact, he already faces at least 5 serious challenges, as well as strong competitors. Therefore, in 2026, it is quite possible that we will witness Orban's downfall. Let me remind you that he may be either under the Kremlin's influence or under its control, or perhaps a combination of the three. Putin is ordering Orban to block European support for Ukraine. Orban likely won't remain in power by 2026 and may face legal troubles over his assets. Meanwhile, Australia has already sent Abrams tanks to Ukraine.
Що відомо такого, що Австралія вже таки віддала Україні танки Абрамс.
According to ABC journalists, the process of loading the first of 49 M1A1 Abrams tanks has recently begun. However, the Australian government does not disclose their current location or expected arrival date in Europe for security reasons. I would also like to remind you that Germany has classified all arms deliveries to Ukraine. During his meeting with Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy thanked him for the tanks. Australia had to wait for Washington's approval before starting the delivery, because these are American tanks. It was only when the United States allowed it, albeit reluctantly, that these tanks began to arrive. It is important to note that we are talking about 49 tanks, which of course is not a drastic change at the front, but it will be a very significant support for our defenders. The New York Times also reports that Russia is building military bases, fighter jet shelters, and helicopter landing sites on the border with Finland. The newspaper writes that Russia is preparing long-term plans in response to Finland's accession to the North Atlantic Alliance and is therefore increasing its military presence on this border. The Finnish Ministry of Defense fears that in the event of peace in Ukraine, Russia will begin to deploy even more troops to their border, and in 5 years the number of Russian troops in the region could triple. We are returning to the point we have already made. Europeans are really afraid that if there is an active cessation of hostilities in Ukraine, the Baltic states and other members of the North Atlantic Alliance on the Baltic Sea coast will be at risk. So draw your conclusions, our partners, and help us with weapons if you do not want Russia to start attacking you. Hybrid attacks are already underway, so that was the news as of Monday, May 19th.
Росія почала на вас атаки, а гібридні атаки вже тривають. Що ж, такими були новини станом на 19 травня, понеділок.
Subscribe to Channel 24 and my YouTube, links below. Like and comment where you're watching from. Each like helps support Ukrainian content and our pro-Ukrainian stance. That's how YouTube's algorithms work.